I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the movie Sleeping Dogs. We are joined today by director and co-writer Adam Cooper and cast member Karen Gillan. And Adam, starting with you, I was interested in throughout the script writing process and kind of as you were figuring out how you wanted to tell this story as a director, how you kind of found the myriad of tones which exist in this film, because it's, this drama with these thriller elements, but also you've got kind of the very interpersonal story with Russell Crowe's character, Roy, and everything that he's going through with memory loss. So how did you set about figuring the tone for the script and as a director?
I kind of let the journey of the protagonist sort of dictate the way that things tonally unfolded. Because he's a man who's bereft of memory and he's kind of lost and confused and disconnected. I think the choices around tone were all meant to kind of ape the character's personal experience. So I tried not to sort of assert a tone with such deliberation, like because it's a whodunit, and because it's a dramatic whodunit, I think it was always going to live sort of between certain parameters. Like it was never going to be funny. Um, so I just tried to sort of kind of keep it on story and keep it on character and kind of let the way the story was unfolding and what the character's journey was kind of dictate tone.
That's wonderful. And Karen, for you, I love the way that we're introduced to your character because essentially we're getting a voiceover narration from Richard, from another character in the film that's talking about his perspective of her. And I was interested in how that really helped you in figuring out who she was because there's so many details and some of them are very specific and factual. She speaks this many languages, she was studying this, she knows this, but also at the same time, it's a very objective perspective. So you can kind of look at what do you think is the truth of what he's saying and where do you think the truth of the character lies differently?
Yeah, that's what was one of the most exciting things about this role is not only is she sort of a little bit of a chameleon, just generally in the story, but then you're also learning about her through the perspective of other characters. And so there's this whole other layer of like, who is she? Who is this woman? And like, I guess I have an idea of who I think she is, but I think that every audience member could have a different interpretation of that, and that's what I think is really cool, actually. Um, but yeah, she's a very sort of interesting character that has learned to wear a lot of masks throughout her life as a means of survival in the environment that she's been raised in and is currently in.
And Adam, in going back to the central character of Roy, Russell Crowe's character, there's so many great visual elements just in those first few opening sequences where we see how he kind of creates memory for himself and how he creates structure. He has all these little taped notes reminding him who he is, you have Alzheimer's, and just to be able to navigate around his space. So were you researching into that space of memory loss and Alzheimer's, or how did you come up with what those visual elements needed to be?
Yeah, so originally, in an earlier incarnation of the script, the tape on the wall was formerly post-it notes everywhere. I had early artwork done where it literally looked like his apartment was sort of like shingled in post-it notes. Um, and then as I started talking about it with Russell, Russell was like, "Well, the guy used to be a cop. Um, it feels like post-it notes are so just ephemeral. Like they could fall off the wall. If this is a guy who's trying to really, make sure he has these reminders that sort of give him context, it feels like he'd be more meticulous about it. So the idea for the tape on the wall was actually Russell's idea. And you'll notice that there's different colors of tape on the wall because Russell felt like his character, being a former detective, would have color coded everything within sort of categories. So, but to answer your question about sort of just the research around Alzheimer's, I mean, there was some license taken with sort of the nature of his Alzheimer's, the evolution of it, its response to this sort of experimental protocol. It's not a movie that sort of delves into Alzheimer's and its sort of effects on a family, if you will, in the same way that a movie like Still Alice does, you know. But I think but yeah, it was all heavily researched, and I know you know, Russell brought, I think, something special to it in terms of his own personal experience because his dad has had Alzheimer's. So you know, that's kind of just one of those things where I think art was imitating life for him in a certain part of it.
Absolutely. And Karen, and coming back to Laura and your performance, I love the specific kind of dialect that you found for her, and even just the fact that she speaks in a very specific tone of voice. And I was interested in kind of how you played around with different intonations of what she was going to sound like.
Well, thank you. I really love playing around with voice in particular. Like that is my jam. So I was really interested to kind of get my hands on this character vocally because she does assume so many different sort of characteristics depending on who she's talking to. I was like, oh, she's absolutely the type of person that would be impersonating people that she deems intellectual. So I mean, I had my people that I definitely based voices on. I'm almost hesitant to say it because it doesn't sound anything like either of them.
I remember, Karen, I remember who you told me. At least one of them, and one of them's a man.
One of them's a man. I'm just going to say it. But don't think that I was trying to do an impression because it doesn't sound like him. But it was more like she would have watched this guy and maybe just taken on a few of his traits. I went for a little Jordan Peterson for later in the movie, and then for earlier in the movie, I was like, well, maybe she could be like a little like I'd been watching Kate Blanchett in Tar quite a lot, and that character is comes off as a real sort of classical music intellectual type, and I was like, there's no reason why Laura Baines wouldn't be watching that. Like, I don't know if the timelines exactly line up, but in my mind, I was like, that's someone that she would maybe take inspiration from.
That's such a great detail, you know, and for both of you, I was interested in some of the conversations that you had about how much to kind of like play into the audience expectation, because I think the film does a great job at kind of maybe you think it's this person, maybe you think it's that person, and kind of like narratively weaves you in different directions and potentially points the finger at different characters at different points. So how did you set about making sure you were kind of like creating those directions for the audience, but also not revealing too much of the final whodunit element early on in the film?
I mean, for me, I mean, we did have sort of 30,000 foot conversations about, you know, the overall story and any given character's role and import in the telling of that story. But honestly, I think scene to scene, we were mostly just focused on sort of the truth of the character, not so much with trying to, you know, guide or lead the audience in, you know, any one direction or another. It was sort of, you know, I really think it was just about, you know, being truthful in terms of sort of kind of goal, action, and obstacle in any given scene. Um, but you know, the overall performance was really all Karen's crafting. You know, the way that she identified with the character and what she thought her truth was, and you know, this notion of her being a woman who kind of wears many masks, you know, both to protect herself, but also to sort of present in the way that she thinks any given character might want her to present. So, but I wasn't very busy on trying to sort of shape performance in such a way that it was leading the audience one way or another. I mean, you know, Karen really crafted her performance.
I
Is
really
that
love
right? Is that right, Karen?
Oh, well, take some credit. You did craft my performance.
But was that true for you in terms of just playing to the truth of it? Because obviously we spend the whole movie kind of having a little bit of a dance with your character. There's moments where we think she did it, maybe she didn't, and we never really know either way right until the end.
Yeah, so it definitely wasn't my focus for sure. Just because with each scene, I am just trying to play it truthfully and figure out what her motivation is, and you know, that's all I'm concerning myself with is what her motivation is. And I don't think her motivation was ever to make him think that she might have done it. So it didn't really concern me. However, there are things about her character that could lead the audience to believe that. It just so happens. But it's not something that I was trying to push in any way.
And
I mean,
Adam,
we did make, I mean, I would say we certainly made choices to sort of shade and sort of influence the viewer's experience with like how we might shoot something, or what we did in post-production, or what we would do with music, right, around any given character's appearance in the film. Or, you know, we're certainly, you know, building suspense or leading the audience in that regard, but you know, not so much in terms of you know, what we were doing, you know, on the day.
that absolutely makes sense. And in terms of the way that you shot the film, you kind of play around with the idea of perspective. There's moments where we meet characters or we're seeing characters based on how another character is perceiving them or what they've seen, versus kind of going close up to something and seeing it fully as an audience member. And so how did you set about determining throughout the film what's the perspective that you want the audience to see this through?
Well, the film kind of has those chapter headings, and so it's kind of meant to each of those chapter headings in the same way that you know, a cop might be investigating something and looking at each of the suspects. Each of those chapter headings are kind of meant to suggest suspects. So when we're in any one of those chapter headings, we're sort of kind of in the point of view and in the memory of that character's recollection of those given events. Because, you know, I really wanted to just lean into this idea that memory is very much a point of view. Everybody's memory of things is different, and it's always unreliable. So that was definitely something that we tried to lean into.
Absolutely. And Karen, kind of going back to something that you were talking about before in terms of your character behaves in different ways depending on who she's interacting with. And I think that's such a great detail to get to kind of play around with performance-wise. So how did you find what those shifts and adjustments in her were going to be based on who she was in a scene with?
Yeah, that was just really, really interesting to me. I'd been like, just happened to have been researching a bunch of people with certain types of disorders that sort of make them do that type of thing. And then this character came along and I was like, oh, now I can use all of my knowledge that I thought was going to be useless. And yeah, it was like, yeah, I just kind of approached it like, you know, who is she interacting with in the scene? What does she want out of this situation? And then, okay, if she's the type of person that really sort of adjusts depending on who she's talking to, what does she need to do in order to get what she wants? That would mainly be my sort of starting point with everything.
And do you think she's someone who has a strong sense of self or not? Because she exudes a very confident persona about herself, but then she's, you know, like you said, she's adjusting herself for different people in different situations. So there's a malleability to her as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of think it's debatable with this character whether she has a strong sense of self or not. I think that we might all have different answers on that. Like I was working with our intimacy coordinator, actually, who's this incredible woman who is so good with movement and everything. And we ended up just having really deep chats about the character. And actually, her takeaway was that she does have a strong sense of self, which I loved. And I think I think it's more interesting what exists between this character and the people that watch this film rather than like what I think. I mean, I have an idea of what's going on, but I don't think people I don't know if people will agree with me or not. But so I don't know if I should even go into it. Are you interested? I don't know.
Always interested.
I actually think that she doesn't have a strong sense of self. And I think that people are like maybe nervous to hear that from a female role in a film, like, because I think there's such a push to have like very strong female characters. But like, if I'm being totally honest, I think that she doesn't have a strong sense of self, and she almost doesn't isn't able to look inward enough to really face it because of certain things that have gone on in her life early on. And so she wears all these masks. And if you were to remove the masks, I don't think she knows what's under there.
I actually love that. And Adam, in coming back to the idea of kind of playing around with memory, you know, with Russell Crowe's character, memory and memory loss, there's nothing linear about it. One day, you know, he might remember this detail, the next day he remembers that, and then he's forgotten that he ever knew that to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a fascinating thing to get to play around with. And so how did that also kind of influence and shape the way that you were telling the story, especially during the screenwriting process where you're figuring out what is he aware of and what is he cognizant of at any given time in a scene?
It's interesting because what you just said is very narratively forgiving, right? It allows for certain inconsistencies. I guess I would say, even though in truth, memory and memory loss is not linear or consistent, for the sake of the storytelling, given that he's a character who's had a procedure, we did try to keep it as linear as we could, meaning he starts with no memory, and over the course of the story, bits and pieces of his memory start to bleed in, at first triggered by photographs that he sees, right? And then further triggered by conversations with characters that he has. And then it builds to, you know, a hallucination where he thinks he sees Karen's character in a bar, only to realize it wasn't her. And he learns that this experimental protocol that he's doing seems to be working, and he's having a good result. So we kind of tried to keep that linear, I think, for the very question that you're asking, right? Like, how do you keep all of that in order? And it ultimately builds until sort of there's this waterfall of memory that comes back to him ultimately. So we kind of tried to treat his memories like their own investigation, if you will. So as we're using sort of the plot of the murder mystery, the plotting really becomes the mechanism through which the character's memories start coming back.
And there's kind of this visual metaphor on screen with the idea of a jigsaw puzzle, and just like you're trying to kind of like literally piece it together. Where did the idea to use that as a visual tool come from in the film?
The art department was walking me through props, and, you know, set dressing in this warehouse underneath our production offices where everything was stored. And they showed me this glass top table that they were thinking of using for the table in Russell's dining room. And I was thinking about all the action that would be sort of played on top of that table, that there would be papers on it and files, and if he's eating, you know, that would what would be on it. And I started thinking about this shot from underneath the table, um, and that's ultimately where the idea for the puzzle came from. Just the idea of seeing Russell, this big guy, kind of looming over these little pieces. So it's kind of on the nose, but it was really born of the visual. You know, the idea of seeing something come together from underneath. So that's really
my favorite shot in the film, and I love that shot. I think it looks really cool, and I think it's okay to be on the nose.
I mean, it just tells you, work with a glass tabletop.
Directing 101, glass tabletop.
Yeah, glass tabletop.
I also wanted to talk about the scene where Karen, your character Laura, encounters Russell Crowe's character for the first time in several years. And I wanted to ask you both about that scene, because it's kind of fun to watch, especially because there's kind of a power shift very quickly where she's like, oh, he doesn't remember that we ever met. He doesn't have all of his kind of like cognitive facets about him, and he doesn't have any memory. And so immediately she kind of knows that she has the upper hand and she can potentially play into that. And so starting with you, Karen, how did you want your character to go into that encounter once she learns that?
Yeah, that once she learns that she maybe does have the upper hand because he doesn't remember everything, yeah, that definitely causes a shift in the dynamic. And then I got to have some fun with it. I think that as soon as she realizes that, she realizes that she can play with him a little bit and get some enjoyment out of it. So she does exactly that. And yeah, I think she's getting a little bit of a kick out of the whole thing. The fact that he's even suspicious of her is probably a little bit thrilling to her. And yeah, it was just so much fun to do that scene with Russell as well, because there's nothing better than a good, scene where you're locked into each other and you're really keeping that eye contact, and then there's just shifts in power. And yeah, that was probably my favorite scene to film in the movie.
That's so great. And how about for you, Adam, in terms of going into directing that scene, what were kind of the most important key details that you wanted to make sure you captured in a moment like that?
Karen, was that so the scene that Mara's referring to, was that your first day with Russell?
Oh, I was talking about my last day, actually. The scene. I was talking about the scene where they sort of get into it and sit down. Uh,
Oh.
after the scene where she figures out that he doesn't remember.
Oh, okay, got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Is that the scene
But
that is that the scene
yeah,
you were
the
talking
other
about, Mara?
yeah,
I was
so
thinking about kind of like the first encounter, but actually like touching
oh.
up. You wanted, no, it's
Right,
all good.
well, apply all of everything I said
Yeah.
to not that scene and to another scene.
You can talk about whichever of those scenes work.
Well, well, I loved that scene. So that scene was shot on a street in Melbourne that was right by the cricket grounds. Um, um, and I think that was your first day working
It was my
working.
first substantial day with Russell. I'd done maybe a little flashback where I walked past him in a bar prior to,
Oh, right, right, right,
but that wasn't really like enough to get a feel for acting with Russell. So that was
right.
that was the first experience. Yeah.
Yeah. My my favorite part of that scene is the end of the scene when Karen's character says, "You take care of yourself now, Roy." Like she calls him by his name at the end of the scene, which makes Russell turn around and look back at her in a way that goes, "Well, that was very familiar." Just in a look. So that scene is kind of like a classic power scene. Um, um, I was never an actor, but I had studied with this guy named Roy London a long time ago in LA. Just like as a writer, wanting to understand actors better, and he would always talk about, dramatic dramatic content is the scene work is all about love or power. You're either trying to exert your power over somebody or you're trying to get their love. Um, and that scene to me is just sort of like a classic power scene. And so it was really fun to watch that. Karen's character is coming out of her apartment and Russell's character kind of shows up unexpectedly and catches her off guard. So it's a very contained scene, but it has lots of beats in it. Um, and those are fun to watch. That was a really fun scene. It was a hot day though, if I remember. I remember Karen being under an umbrella.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, because I'm a ginger.
yeah.
Against
Um,
burn, especially in Australia, that would have been really bad.
yeah. That was also the day that um I walked into a low-lying post and nearly amputated my ankle.
What?
So that was a big day.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Drama off camera as well as on for that day. And Karen as well, with your character, I love that we get to see her kind of like fully reestablish herself between the flashback sequences and the present. And you were talking about it a little bit before about those two different versions, because in essence, she's kind of retreated from life, reestablished herself, put herself out there professionally under a completely different name. So in essence, she's trying to like reshape her identity from the ground up after everything earlier on. And so how much of a difference did you want there to be? Because it's that idea that she's rebuilding herself, but at the end of the day, she still is the same person that she was earlier.
Yeah, that was probably when I was reading the script and I saw that she came back in a sort of different capacity, that was the moment I was like 100% in. I remember being like, oh yeah, because now I get the opportunity to like play two different versions of this person and yeah, find the sort of threads that connect them, but also like if she is this person that does assume different characteristics, I get to have extra fun with that. So yeah, I was like, right, well, maybe, between when we last see her and her current life, like she's been watching a bunch of Jordan Peterson interviews on YouTube. And I'm sure other people as well. And like just kind of building this new life for herself, this new identity, and presenting herself in this kind of new shiny way.
I love that. And Adam, one of the other details that I love in the way that you've directed this is it feels like there's a very specific use of light and shadow throughout. Again, just in terms of once you framed a shot, figuring out where is it that you want to draw or focus and where do you want us to kind of be keyed into in a scene, and even just like the color palette as well within that. So how did you set about figuring out that visual language?
Well, I think the stuff with light and shadow plays well in sort of a mystery suspense movie because it's all about things that are hidden and not everything is seen. It's also that you're also dealing with a number of characters who have a duplicity to them. And so hiding part of their face in shadow or parts of them in shadow is, I think, a good way of visually suggesting that duplicity. But in terms of just kind of like the color palette of the film, because the present tense of the story is really seen through the lens of Russell's character, and his world is kind of grim and because he's bereft of memory, I sort of equated that with it being kind of devoid of color. So it's kind of really desaturated. It's colder, it's bluer, grayer, browner. And the world of the past, of memory, is much warmer. We shot the stuff in the present tense all with anamorphic lenses, so everything is kind of a little bit bendy around the sides and off. And we shot everything in the past, so all the stuff with Laura Baines, all the stuff at the university, any of the stuff that is sort of flashback or memory, we shot all that with spherical lenses. So it's a bit crisper, but all of the lenses were sort of vintage rehoused lenses. So there's a lot of lens flare in the film, deliberately. So we really just tried to draw a distinction between present and past, and let the journey of Russell's character and sort of the nature of his ordinary world be the thing that kind of dictated the look in the present.
It's so wonderful. I really, really loved hearing all of the details of everything that went into the creation of this film. So thank you so much for sharing all of this and congratulations on the movie.
Thanks so
Thank you so
much.
much.